So I'd like to welcome everyone to this year's Drench Memorial Lecture. I have to make a rather long intro today, not for a happy reason. In February, I sent out an invitation to Dan and Barbara Drench, who were the people who endowed this lecture. 1991, I believe it was the first endowed fellowship that YIVO received. And it was Dan Drench's initiative to set it up. And thank you for the invitation. At this writing, we planned to be there. Unfortunately, it was not to be. On Friday, Dan Drench died at the age of 91. And he was the most involved, most enthusiastic of all of our fellowship benefactors. So it's kind of a cruel fate to miss this lecture because he attended every year faithfully. As I said, was the most enthusiastic, was the happiest to meet the people who benefited from his generosity, to spend time with them, to get to know them. So I just want to say a few words about him. I knew him for a number of years, and yes, and he was endowed in memory of his parents, and actually he asked me to say a few words about them too last time I spoke with him, so I'm going to tell you that. Just to crib from the death notice in the newspaper, since I didn't know that much about his biography, he was born in the Bronx in 1921, graduated from City College in 1943, served in World War II, was the founder of the Artisan Electronics Corporation, a leader in the New Jersey Jewish community, proud husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather. As I said, a very nice man and very, very involved. Not the kind of person to just give a gift to an institution like YIVO and then disappear. And always made sure to let us know they would spend time in Israel in the winter, and always said, don't schedule the lecture in the winter, make sure to wait at least until April when we come back. So I knew, always wait till right after Passover, because after Passover they would come back. And so his wife called me to say that he had died and that she is sitting Shiva this week, obviously. So she's not here either. I hope she will be back in the future. But anyway, it's important to just to know who Dan Drench was, and to let her know that he'll be missed very much at this lecture today and in the future. Now, as we said, the lecture was endowed in memory of his parents, and he did a little bio of them. So I'd like to read that to you. Rose and Isidore Drench were born before the turn of the 20th century in Bessarabia. They came to the United States before World War I and worked in the garment industry. They married in 1918, and Rose retired from the garment industry to raise a family. She returned to work in a fur coat factory in 1932 and continued into her 60s because her husband was disabled because of her desire to see her children educated, and because her son went to service in World War II. Throughout their years of employment, Rose and Isidore were committed to the improvement of workers' conditions through their support of unions and membership in the ILGWU and the Furriers Joint Council. Their concern for social justice and for the cultural improvement of the working Jewish community was further expressed by lifelong membership in the Workmen's Circle, briefly in the International Workers' Order, and support for the schools and summer camps. It is in memory of their personal sacrifices, the integrity which guided their lives, their respect for scholarship and love of Yiddishkeit, and the enduring gratitude of their children that this research fellowship has been endowed at YIVO. And as you know, this is a fellowship in American Jewish history, in particular in the history of the labor movement. And so while we do not have research in the labor movement every year, we do most years, and that is what we look for. So with that sad duty fulfilled, I'd just like to introduce briefly our speaker. Caroline Luce is a doctoral candidate at UCLA. She's doing research, as we said, in Jewish labor history. Her dissertation is entitled Visions of a Jewish Future, the Jewish Bakers Union and Yiddish Culture in Los Angeles, 1920 to 1950. And she has a chapter forthcoming in Life in Mosaic, 150 Years of Jewish Life in Los Angeles. Forgive me, I just have to put in a word from our sponsor as well. That a week from today at 3 o'clock, not at 4 o'clock, at 3 o'clock in this same room, will be the next fellowship lecture. It's the Hort Memorial Lecture by Sonny Yudkov of Harvard, right? Of Harvard, and she will be speaking about American Yiddish literature, a tubercular perspective, because tuberculosis actually plays an important role in Yiddish literature. So that's the word from our sponsor. Back to today's event. The title of today's lecture is similar but not quite the same. As you can see, Visions of a Jewish Future, Jewish Bakers, Community Organizing, and Yiddish Culture in the Southland by the Sea. And I think I've said enough. Without further ado, Caroline Luce.
Hi. So I want to say thank you first to Mother Nature for this fabulous sunny weather. I think it kind of sets the appropriate mood to talk about Los Angeles. And of course to YIVO and the Drench family. This project would not be possible without their support and the amazing things housed here in this building. I want to thank Jennifer Young and Herschel Glasser and all the folks in the reading room who've helped me during my visits over the years. And by allowing me to speak here today, you're implicitly recognizing that there was Yiddish life in early 20th century Los Angeles, which is sort of a controversial claim. And that fact alone fulfills my basic goal as a historian and the goals that my subjects devoted their lives to. I'm tremendously flattered and humbled to be included as among their fellowship recipients and deeply thankful. So what I want to do for you today is provide just an overview of my work on Yiddishkeit in Southern California. First, I want to briefly sketch the historiography about Jewish life in LA, showing how Boyle Heights, the neighborhood where most of the city's Yiddish-speaking immigrants settled, earned a reputation as the Lower East Side of LA. I then want to interrogate that reputation by introducing you to some of my individual characters in my dissertation, briefly sketching their biographies and exploring some of their early efforts to develop Yiddish public culture in the neighborhood. Here, I will emphasize the important ways in which the neighborhood was different from those elsewhere, and how these differences caused intense ideological and personal rivalries that have obscured the community's history. I will then show how one union of Jewish bakers navigated this factionalism to form a broad-based coalition, arguing that by using food as the medium of their activism, they cultivated a particular model of market-oriented class consciousness that served to unite the Jewish community of Boyle Heights. And finally, I will sketch where my dissertation goes from there, outlining my final two chapters, which explore how Yiddish-based community organizing changed in the 1930s in response to both the Great Depression and the rise of Hitler and anti-Semitism in Los Angeles. So I want to start with one of the images that was widely circulated by the Los Angeles boosters and continues to affect sort of popular imagination of the city. This is the cover of a promotional magazine called Land of Sunshine. You could see at the top. And there's a couple things to notice here. First, we can see this idea of the virgin territory. The land is basically unoccupied. There's some palm trees and some quaint farms, but there's no people in this image. This vision of Southern California as virgin territory, a place where any man can come and make their fortune, continues to attract people from all over the country, particularly those seeking to make it big in Hollywood. We've also got this beautiful virginal white woman who's presiding over this landscape. Even though just a few decades before this image was published, the land she's looking over was Mexico, there's no native peoples or Mexicans in this image, simply a nod to the mission era of Spanish colonial empire in California. This area is free to become a haven for white Americans like this beautiful woman, free of the class conflict and racial conflict that plagued other cities at the same time. So fantasy-laden images like this were used to sell the city, to promote investment, to attract tourists and settlers alike, a tradition that continues to this day. You may see those lovely California commercials on your television periodically. But the ideological vision that they promoted of Los Angeles as the anti-city, absent of the features of urban life in the early 20th century, an exception to the rules of urban development, has profoundly impacted the way that historians have and continue to think about Los Angeles' Jewish history and the role of LA Jews in American history. This impact was particularly strong on the group of academics, genealogists, and amateur historians who first set out to write LA's Jewish history in 1954, surrounding the 100-year anniversary of organized Jewish life in LA. Most had recently moved from points east, and in their work, they showcased aspects of the Jewish experience unique to Southern California, rather than those associated with New York, like the Yiddish life and the Jewish labor movement. The bulk of their work accordingly focused on the incredible successes of two groups of exceptional men: the Jewish pioneers who came to LA in the mid-19th century, and the Jews of Hollywood. Hellman, Newmark, and the other Jewish immigrants of the pioneer generation came to LA from Germany and Western Europe in the 1850s and found great financial success. Merchants like Newmark built massive trading enterprises, invested in oil and utilities, and bought huge swaths of land that they later subdivided into the city's first suburbs. Hellman, with the help of depositors like Newmark, built the city's first bank, the Farmers and Merchants Bank, which bankrolled much of this early development and eventually merged to form Wells Fargo. These guys settled in affluent neighborhoods north and west of downtown and were fully integrated into the city's Anglo elite. They also built the first synagogues and charities, and along with their descendants, played important leadership roles in Jewish organized life well into the 20th century. LA's Jewish history is also dominated by studies of the Jews of Hollywood, including famous studio executives like Carl Lammel and Sam Goldwyn, pictured here, as well as the emigre writers, composers, artists, and intellectuals who came to Los Angeles in the 1930s seeking refuge from the Nazis, including Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, Igor Stravinsky, Richard Neutra. I noticed in the exhibit over there you have Mr. Newman, who became a writer in Hollywood. Generations of academics have explored the lives of these amazingly talented men and their impact on American culture. And it's really hard not to be enthralled with the glamour of this community. And considering the centrality of the entertainment industry to LA's economy, its culture, and even its politics, it's almost impossible to tell the city's history without these guys. LA also figures prominently in studies of post-war Jewish life. Its sprawling suburbs have become the preferred location for examinations of Jewish upward mobility and assimilation into the white middle class in the years after World War II. LA's Jewish population exploded in this period, rising to over 500,000 by the 1960s, as Jewish GIs and American-born children of immigrants embraced their newfound affluence and headed to the Golden Cities, as Deborah Dash Moore once described them. While most studies in this period emphasize how Jews became white folks, picking up the trope from our original image, more and an increasing number of younger scholars are highlighting the innovative forms of community life developed in LA that held the Jewish population together despite their dispersal throughout this sprawling environment, offering more nuanced approaches to Jewish suburbanization. I mean, that's some kind of sprawl, huh? It goes for miles. The consequence of this three foci, however, is that Yiddish life in Boyle Heights has received very little scholarly attention. To date, there haven't been any significant studies of the role of the local Yiddish language press or the neighborhood's various Yiddish newspapers and literary journals. No biographies written about the men and women who founded local Yiddish-based organizations or the local Yiddish poets, writers, and artists. There are no available translations of locally published Yiddish literature beyond a few scattered poems, and only one partial bibliography of locally published works. Instead, scholars and popular observers alike frequently cite the presence of Yiddish life and organizations in the neighborhood as evidence that Boyle Heights mimicked other Jewish immigrant ghettos. Rather than explore the unique contours of Yiddish life in Boyle Heights, they have simply equated the experiences of the neighborhood's Jewish residents to those of Jewish immigrants elsewhere, referring to it as the Lower East Side of Los Angeles. But one need only see pictures from the early 20th century to see the absurdity of those equations. These pictures are from 1924, and you can see that even by then, the area was relatively sparsely populated. Those are all single-family homes, one story, and underdeveloped. In the 1890s, while Lower East Side was becoming a home to millions of Jews, Boyle Heights was home to just a handful of wealthy landowners living on large estates. But when the city built a series of bridges over the Los Angeles River and streetcar lines to better connect the area to downtown, these landowners rapidly subdivided their estates and sold them off into lots and housing developments. These various subdivisions offered a variety of affordable housing options and attracted a diverse population of Angelenos, both in terms of income levels and race and ethnicity. The neighborhood from its earliest days was home to large numbers of Mexican immigrants, a sizable Japanese population, as well as Armenians, White Russians, and African Americans, a multi-ethnic composition that increased over time and Jews never comprised a clear majority of the population. When the Homeowners Loan Corporation investigated Boyle Heights in 1939, for example, they dubbed it hopelessly heterogeneous. So I want to make sure we know where I'm talking about here. This is LA. This is downtown right here. Beverly Hills, Hollywood up here. This is the west side where many of you may have stayed in Santa Monica. UCLA's little thing right there. The beaches are down here. This is Boyle Heights. We're talking right here, this little pocket just southeast of Los Angeles. And as you can see in this map, there were at least 6 freeways built in and around the neighborhood in the years after World War II that largely cut it off from the rest of the city, in combination with the dismantling of the streetcar. Those who could afford to, including most of the neighborhood's Jewish population, left during those years. And today, the neighborhood is home primarily to Mexican Americans, regarded by many as a barrio. This has given rise to a narrative of ethnic succession. The idea that as every former resident of the neighborhood I talk to tells me, that the neighborhood is Mexican today, but it used to be Jewish. A generalization that overlooks significant structural changes in the neighborhood's geography and demography. But even as you can see today, Boyle Heights is pretty suburban. I mean, this is it today. It's 80% single-family homes in that quintessential California bungalow style. So even today, it defies what one thinks of when you think of a sort of ghetto neighborhood. My dissertation starts from this departure point, highlighting how the particular environment and socioeconomic hierarchy in Boyle Heights flavored Yiddish-based labor and community organizing and the efforts to develop local Yiddish culture. I used previously unexamined Yiddish language materials, including the rich resources housed here at YIVO, to explore the lives of a cohort of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who came west in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and pioneered the development of Yiddish-based fraternal, labor, educational, and cultural organizations in the neighborhood. My first chapter begins in 1908, when a small group of men gathered in downtown LA to discuss the possibility of forming the city's first Yiddish culture club. Most were only in their 20s, but had at that point years of experience with community organizing and revolutionary activism in both Europe and America. They were, as one attendee described, quote, national-minded people pervaded with socialist aspirations, end quote, born in various areas throughout the Russian Empire during the tumultuous years of violent pogroms and economic and political marginalization that followed the assassination of Alexander Tsar II, or Tsar Alexander II. Their stories help to illuminate the variety of personal experiences and ideological influences that motivated their lifelong commitment to developing Yiddish public culture in the neighborhood. So this is Peter Kahn. Kahn was born to a family of famous rabbis in Kiev, but at 18 dropped out of school to join the student demonstrations and became a member of the Jewish Labor Bund, a revolutionary socialist organization formed to organize trade unions, strikes, and protests among the Jewish workers of Poland and Russia. Kahn was eventually exiled to Siberia, but escaped his labor camp, traveling undercover across Europe until he reached London, where he worked in the library of famous anarchist intellectual Peter Kropotkin. There, he became an avid Yiddishist and a close associate of Bundist intellectual leader Chaim Zhitlowski, with whom he later traveled to New York. Chaim Shapiro and his older brother Aaron were veterans of what they called the National Radical Bavegum, a movement that wed socialism and Zionism. They were sons of a successful local merchant in Charkov, which is in present-day Ukraine, and like Kahn, received an extensive education. Aaron became involved with the revolutionary movement after he was rejected from university because of the quotas imposed on Jewish admissions. After rumors spread of an impending pogrom in their hometown, the Shapiro brothers, ages 18 and 15 respectively, helped to organize a branch of the Zionist Workers' Organization, an act for which Aaron was sent to a labor camp in Siberia. He fled to New York and was joined by his brother Chaim 2 years later after he served 6 months in Oedeker prison for his involvement in a strike at the peak of the 1905 revolution. You can see he's very proud of himself for that revolutionary act. There, they split a paper route so they could continue their education and their involvement in the labor Zionist movement. Pinchas Karl was born outside of Lodz, Poland, one of 18 children, and was sent to apprentice with a local shoemaker. At 14, he joined the Bund and showed a talent for public speaking that attracted the attention of the Tsarist police. So in 1902, at the age of 20, he fled to Paterson, New Jersey, where he helped organize the first branch of the Arbiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle, a Yiddish-based mutual aid organization created by Bundists in America. 3 years later, he headed to LA seeking new opportunity. Julius Levitt, our final man over here on the left, was born in Dnipropetrovsk, which is located in present-day Belarus, to a family of landowning timber dealers. After the passage of the May Laws, his family was stripped of their land and moved to Vilna, where Levitt worked as a clerk to support the family at the age of 14. There, he began publishing articles in the local Yiddish-language newspaper, joined the Bund, and helped to organize a strike amongst his fellow clerks. Levitt was imprisoned 6 times by the Tsarist police, apparently because his height made him stand out in a crowd, before fleeing to America in 1906. He settled in Newark, where he helped to organize a trade union amongst his fellow workers at a local factory, and began writing for the Forwards, the largest Yiddish newspaper in America. I assume everyone here knows Forwards. Levitt was such an effective leader in Newark that the Arbiter Ring and the Forwards administration eventually sent him to Los Angeles to build those organizations there. Although the Shapiro brothers and their fellow labor Zionists differed from Levitt, Karl, and the other Bundists in regard to their beliefs about nationalism and the necessity of a Jewish state, they also shared some important and overlapping ideological principles. Both groups believed that cultivating national self-consciousness among Jews in all of the multi-ethnic states in which they lived could ensure the freedom and self-determination of the Jewish community. As socialists, they also believed that ensuring such freedom demanded a fundamental reordering of society, both within the Jewish community and without, a revolutionary transformation of the capitalist order that would be led by the Jewish working class. And both groups believed that culture played a vital role in that transformation and sought to forge a new, modern, secular Jewish national culture based in Yiddish language and Eastern European folk traditions, which they regarded as the authentic culture of the Jewish people. They believed that Yiddish culture could serve as a vehicle for mobilizing the Jewish masses to bring about a revolutionary change and for fostering a socialist Jewish nationalism. The ideological differences between them were significant and over time would become increasingly contentious, but together they comprised a cohort of Eastern European Jewish immigrants that I refer to as Yiddish socialists. But while these men came to LA with significant organizing experience in both their European and American homes, the realities of life in Boyle Heights were fundamentally different from those other areas and complicated their efforts. Firstly, the Jewish population was tiny compared to that of Eastern cities in the same period. Until 1920, the Jewish population in the entire city of Los Angeles remained under 20,000, only a few thousand of whom were of Eastern European descent. Now, just to underline this contrast, by 1910, in the Lower East Side alone, was home to 540,000 Jewish immigrants. So you can see the size of the community was just much, much smaller. Even at its peak in the 1930s, Boyle Heights only had 50,000 or so Jewish residents, and in 1908, it looked more like this picture here, home to only a handful of Jewish families. Those early residents, like Abraham Magid, whose quote is up there describing his new neighborhood, consistently referred to it as a yeshuv, a colony or settlement. While they may have wanted to build separate organizations to represent their specific ideologies, because their yeshuv was so small, the Yiddish socialists were forced to work together. LA's economy was also comparatively underdeveloped and lacked the large-scale industrial facilities of other early 20th century cities. The economy was based primarily on agriculture, real estate, and tourism, which local business interests attempted to grow using images like the one we examined at the beginning of this lecture. As a result, both political and economic capital were highly concentrated in the hands of a few powerful elites, including many of the Jewish pioneers I mentioned earlier. These business leaders formed powerful organizations to wield their political influence and worked closely with the Los Angeles Police Department to tightly monitor and suppress labor and left-wing organizing so as to maintain the city's reputation as a pro-business environment and entice investment. To the Yiddish socialists, these Jewish elites represented everything they were fighting against. They were highly assimilated, super capitalists who were at the best aloof to the trials and tribulations of the Jewish folks' masses. They were particularly critical of their treatment of one stream of migrants, those suffering from tuberculosis and other chronic lung diseases who had been enticed to come to LA by the boosters' claims about the local climate. By some estimates, these health seekers and their families constituted over a quarter of the migrants to Los Angeles between 1890 and 1920, including Peter Kahn and Aaron Shapiro, who both came with loved ones suffering from the White Plague. But local Jewish elites regarded them with suspicion and disdain. Editorials in the city's Jewish newspaper at the time warned that the city would become, quote, overrun with people who have come from all parts of the world with little health and little means, end quote. While they built charitable organizations to support them, including a small hospital for tuberculars in Boyle Heights, they often refused to administer aid to those arrivals who they felt were unfit to receive it, and sometimes bought them train tickets to send them back to New York. At the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum in early 20th century LA was the multi-ethnic working class, composed primarily of non-white agricultural and domestic workers and day laborers. Most of these workers settled in neighborhoods like Boyle Heights because the vast majorities of the city's residential neighborhoods were governed by restrictive racial covenants, barring non-whites from renting or owning property. Although Los Angeles lacked the discriminatory Jim Crow laws that governed most of the cities in the South, a de facto Jim Crow system prevailed, and many of the city's public and recreational spaces were highly segregated. Non-white minorities were also largely excluded from the few trade unions that did exist, primarily those that emerged among highly skilled workers in the building trades who were of English, Irish, German, and American descent. This property right here, this is actually in Belvedere, which is just east of Boyle Heights. You can tell it's sort of a lean-to, if you will. Despite their antagonisms towards them, the successes of the Jewish immigrants who came to LA before the Yiddish socialists gave them some advantages in navigating this industrially backward economy that their non-Jewish neighbors were denied. They came with hard skills and often with English language fluency and had access to education, home, and business loans. Unlike the radical intellectuals who came to the Lower East Side, the Yiddish socialists of LA were not forced to work in factories alongside their neighbors to make a living. The Shapiro brothers attended law school at USC and opened their own practice together. Peter Kahn had his own wholesale produce company, and Pinchas, the shoemaker Carl, opened his own cobbler shop, which by the 1920s grew into a multi-unit franchise. Any of you who were in LA in the 1940s and 50s might remember Carl's Shoes. It eventually had 150 locations in 4 states. Jews quickly became the majority of the neighborhood's small business owners and professionals, and because of their skills and likely their skin color, Jewish tradesmen found employment in skilled trades and joined unions, often earning significantly higher wages than their non-Jewish neighbors. Los Angeles' intensely stratified and racialized socioeconomic hierarchy thereby challenged the Yiddish socialists' understanding of their own ethnic and class-based identities. While in Europe, they had been marginalized and disenfranchised because of their ethnicity, in Los Angeles, that ethnicity afforded them privileges. They were largely regarded as white, given access to unions, education, and professions from which other immigrants were excluded. Although their wealth and power paled in comparison to that of Jewish elites, some of their non-Jewish neighbors made less than $2 a day working in the fields of the Central Valley. In the context of Boyle Heights, the Yiddish socialists were not on the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, and it became very difficult to identify a distinct Jewish working class. As I show in my dissertation, the Yiddish socialists responded to these realities by forcefully fusing their ethnic and class-based identities. Using Yiddish, they carved an autonomous cultural, political, and economic space for themselves that was distinct from both that of Jewish elites and from their non-Jewish neighbors. They did so in multiple ways. First, they created mutual aid-based alternatives to the charity of Jewish elites and local synagogues, organizing the city's first branches of the Arbiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle, and Poet Zion, a fraternal organization for labor Zionists, both organizations which used membership dues to pay for Jewish burials and other financial needs of their members. These fraternal organizations, in turn, gave rise to the city's first Jewish unions, beginning with the Ladies' Tailors Union, as well as those for Jewish carpenters, painters, and of course, bakers, and also a branch of the Socialist Party, a Yiddish language branch of the Socialist Party. These organizations could, of course, not help the neediest of LA's Jewish population, those suffering from tuberculosis. And so the Yiddish socialists formed the Jewish Consumptive Relief Association in 1913 to raise funds to develop their own hospital to serve all of those afflicted with the White Plague regardless of need. As the legend goes, the call to action had been initiated after 2 young tuberculars died homeless on the street. And by the following year, the JCRA had raised enough money to purchase this 15-acre plot of land in Duarte, California, just 30 miles east of downtown. They solicited funds to raise buildings from local Yiddish-based organizations and their international affiliates. This is the Arbiter Rings building. This is one of the first buildings on the campus. And established branches of the organization in San Francisco, Cleveland, Chicago, and San Diego that raised buildings of their own. The campus grew rapidly, housing a large medical center, a library named for Sholem Aleichem, a recreation hall, and became known to its patients as the City of Hope. After the advent of antibiotics, aka a cure for tuberculosis, the City of Hope evolved into a modern medical research hospital and is currently one of the premier cancer centers in the world. This is the City of Hope today. It is an incredible institution celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, so hooray for City of Hope. The Yiddish socialists also worked to develop a rich Yiddish cultural world to serve as an alternative to the assimilationist booster fantasies that dominated the culture created by Jewish elites. They developed the Pacific Cooperative Press, which published several journals, including Zunland, depicted here, and an extensive educational apparatus to serve both children and adults in the neighborhood. This Yiddish culture was intended to educate the masses, empower them, and foster both class and national self-consciousness. They formed reading circles and dramatic clubs, people's choruses, and hosted speakers from all over the country, including Baruch Charny Vladek, who was the first speaker in 1911. They also organized Yiddish schools for children so that Yiddish language and culture would be part of their identities, including this one. This is the Workman's Circle School on Evergreen Boulevard. You may be able to see Chaim Shapiro's over here. And as you can see in these pictures, women often played leadership roles in these cultural efforts. As the title of the publication here reveals, these cultural efforts also often took a specifically Western flavor. They named their journals Sunland and Pacific, wrote poems about the ocean and orange blossoms. The local literary salon referred to itself as the Group West. And local Yiddish poets often wrote about the contrast between LA and their previous homes and the realities of life that differed from the fantasies perpetuated by the boosters. But while the City of Hope was a non-sectarian institution, the bulk of the Yiddish socialist efforts explicitly excluded their non-Jewish neighbors, if for no other reason than because of the use of Yiddish. They formed a community life in East LA that was not only an alternative to that of Jewish elites, but was also largely separate from the rest of the neighborhood's residents. In the eyes of some, this limited the effectiveness of their abilities to make real social change. For example, while the Yiddish socialists organized certain sectors of the garment industry, specifically the furriers and the clothes makers, this is Los Angeles, right? You don't see anyone wearing furs and cloaks in these pictures. And the bulk of the local industry, over 80%, was made up of dressmakers who were largely Mexican and female. So while their unionization efforts helped the male Jewish workers in the garment industry, they fell short of the industry-wide solidarity that fueled the uprising of the 20,000 here in New York. As the economy and population grew in the 1920s, these exclusions became increasingly controversial among the Yiddish socialists. Like elsewhere, the controversies were ignited by the formation of the Communist Party, USA, and the arrival of a new, more militant group of activists who arrived in LA already members of the communist movement. They called themselves the Group of 20. But in my study, I argue that these conflicts were more related to the fundamental tensions embedded in their ideologies. As socialists, they sought to foster a universal working-class consciousness that transcended ethnic, racial, and national differences. But as Jewish nationalists, they emphasized the shared interests of Jews as Jews throughout the global diaspora, placing positive value on Jewish cultural and ethnic difference. Using Yiddish in their activism helped to reconcile their socialism and their nationalism, but also limited their outreach among the neighborhood's non-Jews. These tensions between socialist universalism and Jewish particularism were inflamed in the particular context of LA, where their ethnic and racial and class-based identities were increasingly challenged. The new arrivals saw a Jim Crow city and criticized the predecessors for failing to organize the city's true proletarians and address the massive racial inequality in the city. Those members of the original cohort of immigrants who led the area's organizations found the left-wingers insulting and disruptive, referring to them as a megefa, which is a plague or a pestilence. By 1923, these conflicts had engulfed virtually all of Boyle Heights' Yiddish-based organizations and institutions. Eventually, the left-wingers split off entirely, forming their own unions, an independent arbiter ring, their own Volksschule, all of which were housed in a large building on Brooklyn Avenue they called the Cooperative Center, which was also the headquarters of the neighborhood's branch of the Communist Party. These conflicts, in turn, have obscured the history of the Yiddish-speaking community in Boyle Heights, resulting in a near constant cycle of organizational collapses and reorganizations that even I, after 7 years, still have trouble making sense of. But one group emerged as a point of popular consensus, the Jewish Bakers Union. The bakers were part of the cohort of Yiddish socialists who came to LA in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and were members of the Arbiter Ring, Poet Zion, and the JCRA. In my second chapter, I showcase their activism, showing how they successfully navigated the factionalism of their community by cultivating a model of class consciousness based on shared interest in the market for bread, rather than a Marxist model based on the shared relationship to the mode of production. In doing so, they provided a means through which the Jewish community of Boyle Heights could express a working class identity regardless of their income level or profession. Their union became a unifying force in the local Jewish labor movement. So the bakers' understanding of their craft was deeply connected to Jewish religious and cultural traditions surrounding food. Breads, both those involved in ritual observance like challah and matzah, as well as those with secular origins like rosavar and rye bread, provided Jews with spiritual and physical sustenance in both Europe and America. The importance of the baker's role reflected in a Yiddish proverb which advises, "Besser dem Baker wie dem Doktor," which basically means better to pay the baker than the doctor. But in the American context, the traditional importance of bread and the Jews who baked it was being threatened in new ways. Firstly, progressive Americanization advocates and social workers seeking to reform the domestic habits of immigrants encouraged them to eat like, quote, proper Americans by buying whiter breads instead of dark Jewish rye. The Jewish bakeries in LA also faced tremendous competition from the bakeries of the Bread Trust, 3 giant national baking conglomerates that, as the octopus here implies, were gradually taking over the national market for bread. These firms mechanized the baking process and maintained strict anti-union policies in their bakeries so that they could sell the brand name breads at massively reduced prices in grocery stores throughout the city. Their lighter white breads became enticing and cheaper alternatives to the rye and pumpernickels sold by the Jewish bakeries in the neighborhood. And this competitive pressure from the bread trust firms prompted some Jewish bakery owners to mechanize their shops and sever their ties to the union in the hopes that they might lower their labor costs by employing unskilled, non-Jewish bakery workers. The activism of the Jewish Bakers Union thereby pursued dual goals that mirrored those of the rest of their cohort of Yiddish socialists. They sought, on the one hand, to foster Jewish national self-conscious by encouraging Boyle Heights' Jewish residents to buy Jewish, and on the other hand, to cultivate solidarity and class consciousness by encouraging them to buy union. I argue that through their activism, they fused these two goals, aiming to create a secular alternative to the traditional Jewish food chain, which placed rabbis and kosher overseers in charge of community eating habits and leveling taxes on local merchants, replacing it with an alternative form of the Jewish food chain based on their egalitarian values of Yiddish socialism. They did so for both practical and ideological reasons, providing a fitting example of how Yiddish-based community organizing played out in Boyle Heights. 3 strategies proved crucial to the bakers' efforts. Firstly, the bakers worked to promote and advertise their union label, a small version of the union seal that appeared on all goods baked at union-run bakeries. They passed out flyers, printed advertisements in local Yiddish newspapers like this one on the left. They even had their own radio show, all of which encouraged the bread-buying public to kaufen Brotbläus mit dem Union label, buy bread exclusively with the union label. Much of the legwork for the union label campaigns was done by the union's women's auxiliary, which included the wives and daughters of union members. They papered the neighborhood and made house-to-house visits, tapping networks between housewives and non-working women that the union otherwise would not have had access to. Through these efforts, the bakers aimed to convince the women of Boyle Heights that their struggle for fair prices and the union's struggle for fair wages were one and the same. The baker's second strategy, their cooperative bakery, developed out of relationships forged with women in the neighborhood through their union label campaigns. The bakery had originally been founded on Temple Street, closer to downtown, by members of the Jewish Consumers League, a cooperative buying club formed by female members of the Socialist Party, who sold shares in the bakery that entitled them to baked goods at reduced prices. During the wave of intense factional battles in 1923, the union members who worked at the bakery demanded increased workers' control over the bakery's affairs, supported by the left-leaning members of the Consumers League. They moved the bakery into the Cooperative Center on Brooklyn Avenue, home of the Communist Party and several other left-wing organizations, supplying cookies, cakes, and other snacks for the organizations that met at the center, as well as goods for the center's cooperative cafe. The bakery helped to consecrate ties between the Bakers Union and the radicals and activists who frequented the center, including Upton Sinclair, ties which later made the bakery the target of a series of raids by the LAPD's Red Squad. So this is the Cooperative Center today. It's been a Latin dance hall for basically the past 50 years. This is actually the bakery, which is now a tortilleria, a place where you make tortillas. And these used to be windows, but after the raids from the LAPD got really bad, they bricked them up so that you couldn't see what was going on inside. As you can tell, I would love to share more details about the cooperative bakery and would happy to do so after I finish. But the importance of the bakery is that it served as an embodiment of the union's principles. The bakery aligned the concerns of producers and consumers, cutting out capitalist middlemen and rabbinical authorities to create a more equal Jewish food chain that reflected the baker's socialist values. These principles were further underscored by the baker's third strategy, gift giving. The bakers frequently donated bread, cakes, and pies, often baked in the ovens of the cooperative bakery, to a variety of organizations in the neighborhood, including the sanatorium and other local charitable institutions. They also supplied discounted challah and matzah to several neighborhood synagogues, using the donations to reach out to a large population of religiously observant Yiddish-speaking residents of the neighborhood, and garnering credibility with the area's religious leaders that proved a crucial source of pressure against their employers during strikes. Donating the day's unsold bread that would otherwise have been wasted was a practical and easy way to earn social capital with those in the neighborhood who might otherwise have condemned the baker's activities. They used gifts of bread, bagels, and cakes to position themselves as servants of the health and well-being of their community, and all they asked in return of those who received their gifts was that they return the favor by buying union. So through their activism, the bakers cultivated a sense amongst the neighborhood's residents that they shared interests in the market for bread, even if they differed in terms of income level, religious, or ideological beliefs. Even though some of the union's members were openly affiliated with the Communist Party, they avoided proletarian rhetoric and instead appealed to the residents as consumers. By using food as the medium of their activism, they provided a means for all of the neighborhood's Jewish residents to shop as a way of showing solidarity and class consciousness, and to express a working class identity. As a result, they were able to navigate the factionalism and rivalries that plagued the neighborhood's other Yiddish-based organizations and bring together a broad-based coalition that included homeowners and renters, professionals, business owners and wage earners, communists and socialists, the faithful and the secular. But, like other Jewish unions in the neighborhood, the bakers excluded non-Jews from both their membership and their activism. Their understanding of their craft was predicated on particular cultural traditions and notions of gender and skill that exempted other bakers, including Mexican tortilla makers, Asian noodle makers, female bakers, and all varieties of unskilled bakery workers. While excluding those groups may have served to strengthen their unity, over time it also became increasingly limiting. These limitations were brought into sharp focus as the American economy declined during the Great Depression in the 1930s. As Los Angeles' unemployment rate rose to over 30%, food prices plummeted. The competition between local bakers and the bread trust firms increased, and the bakers' traditional model of activism failed. In my third chapter, I argue that these developments forced the bakers to rethink their strategies. They invested their time and energy into two overlapping movements emerging in Southern California: left-wing hunger protests led by the Communist Party of Los Angeles. You can see one of those here. This is from 1933. And the cooperative movement, which was such a powerful force in Southern California that Upton Sinclair attempted to harness its energy in a run for governor in 1934. Both movements built on the market-oriented model of class consciousness that the bakers had worked to cultivate in the 1920s, emphasizing shared struggle to afford one's daily bread as a source of solidarity and providing a means for the bakers to expand their activism beyond the Jewish community of Boyle Heights. Together with a broad coalition of individuals and organizations, most of which were not Jewish, they waged a fight for bread in the early 1930s, facing violent opposition from the city's leaders and the LAPD, including a series of destructive raids on their cooperative bakery that resulted in its closure. When President Franklin Roosevelt passed a series of new legislative protections for collective bargaining, the bulk of this activism shifted towards the labor movement, initiating a surge in organizing led by the unions of the CIO that brought hundreds and thousands of new workers into trade unions in Southern California. By the late 1930s, the Jewish Bakers Union embraced a new organizing style, opening their membership to non-Jews, increasingly using English in their organizing, and expanding their understanding of their craft to include unskilled bakery workers from mass production baking plants. Chapter 4 then examines how the transformative effects of the Depression and the New Deal influenced the Yiddish-speaking community's responses to the rise of Hitler and a spate of increasingly public and bold displays of anti-Semitism in LA, much of it emanating from this building here, called Deutsche Haus, the headquarters of the German-American Bund. Anti-Semitism came to LA along with thousands of new migrants that flocked to the city in the 1930s, including Okies and Arkies, hard hit by the Dust Bowl, who came because the area's economy continued to grow even during the darkest years of the Depression, fueled by the expansion of the automotive industry, the oil industry, and of course, the growth of Hollywood. This economic expansion, in combination with the advances of the labor movement, helped to increase economic mobility of the Jews of Boyle Heights, many of whom began moving out of the neighborhood even as the Jewish population grew to over 50,000 Jewish residents. These advances for Jews also widened the disparities between their experiences and those of their non-white neighbors, many of whom had been exempted from the protections of the New Deal and continued to face intense occupational discrimination and harassment from the LAPD. In this exceptionally fascist environment, I show that the Yiddish socialists began to place increasing emphasis on civil rights in ways that they hadn't in previous decades. Against the orders of the national leaders of their organization, including the Jewish Labor Committee, based here in New York, the local Yiddishists, socialist, communist, and everything in between, set aside long-standing political and ideological conflicts in favor of working together, forming a popular front against fascism that took a particularly Western flavor in LA. They expanded both the cultural and political components of their activism in Boyle Heights, defending the neighborhood as a haven of cultural pluralism, democracy, and interracial cooperation in the face of increasing fascism at home and abroad. Involving their non-Jewish neighbors in their activism and fighting for racial equality, while once sources of conflict between the Yiddishists, became important sources of consensus, as was their willingness to work with communist and left-wing groups whom they defended to their superiors in the East. Unions like the Jewish Bakers Union, who had maintained ties to both the left and the right wings of the Boyle Heights community, also played important roles in holding this fragile coalition together. While much of the scholarship surrounding this period in LA's history emphasizes the leadership of the Hollywood Jewish community, my work asserts the importance of the Yiddishists of Boyle Heights in the local fight against fascism. So I end with these photos. These were taken at the largest event in the period, a march to commemorate the victims of Kristallnacht in November 1938 that was attended by an estimated 15,000 people. While most of the crowd carried Yiddish signs, you may be able to see it was a highly interracial audience and very youthful. It's a lot younger than their previous actions. Activism like this in the late 1930s strengthened organizational and personal relationships and served as a model of interracial coalition building that was the foundation for the civil rights activism of the 1940s and 50s. Through protests like this one, as well as trade unions, the residents of Boyle Heights, particularly the Mexican and Jewish American communities, forged tight bonds that helped to elect the city's first Mexican-American city councilman in 1948 and served as an important force in city and state politics for years to come, even as the construction of the freeways began and Jews began to leave the neighborhoods en masse. The Yiddish's influence on the neighborhood thereby endured long past the end of their lives. While efforts to resurrect the neighborhood's Jewish history began in the late 1990s with a series of oral history projects and a historical preservation campaign to save the area's largest synagogue, its Yiddish culture, the men and women who made it, remain locked in Yiddish language sources, many of which are housed here in this building. I have begun an effort to recover this history in my dissertation and will continue to, but I have only barely scratched the surface. I hope that by speaking here today, I have inspired your interest and encouraged some of my fellow historians and Yiddishists to explore these materials and to make Los Angeles part of their explorations of Yiddish life in America. Thank you. So please, any questions that you might have, I will do my best to answer. Go ahead, Jen.
What in a sense the kind of political and cultural work here being done from a sort of conscious perspective of being on the margins of American life, or did they sort of create their own sense?
Yeah, the word they always use is vanguard, which is it's kind of a laden term within sort of socialist and communist communities, so it's tricky to define. But yes, absolutely, there was this kind of notion that as being on this far left coast, they had an opportunity to sort of create a model that could be future-minded. And that's part of the reason Visions of the Jewish Future is the title of my dissertation. These guys were very future-minded and very self-consciously innovating in a way that was, I think, definitely a product of where they were in the country, and certainly a product of the ideology, frankly, that they inherited of the community. You know, they really bought into this idea that it was this virgin territory where they could make a yeshuv and grow it into this gigantic community. So some of the things they start innovating in the late 1930s, for example, are English language branches of the Workmen's Circle, the first of which they called the Vanguard branch, you know. So I think their sort of location and the size of the community really enhanced this sense that they had this incredible opportunity to be really innovative and do things that they wouldn't be able to do elsewhere, for sure. Go ahead.
Our family arrived in Los Angeles from New York in 1937, when I entered UCLA as a freshman.
Go Bruins.
From Brooklyn High School. But when we talk about the Workmen's Circle, you mentioned briefly the International Workers' Order.
Right.
The YIVO, which as I remember it, had large numbers of members and focused very much on the left wing of things, very close, connected with Popular Front, the ideas of the Soviet Union at the time, and they even had some children's schools.
They did, indeed.
For Yiddish, so that the balance was sort of uneven in favor of the Workmen's Circle.
Right.
But it was growing, and for a large number of the population, the IWO was pretty effective in sponsoring Yiddish and in the left-wing aspects.
Yeah.
If I may say a little more,
Go ahead.
we did not live in Boyle Heights. When we first came to Los Angeles, we moved into the what you'd call the major Jewish sector, which was Beverly Fairfax.
Right. Right.
And Beverly Fairfax was a nice middle-class neighborhood where my family lived. And my family, my father, being a furrier and a member of the Fur Workers Union of New York, did find employment in Los Angeles as a working furrier.
Right.
And that continued the connection between us and him and New York.
Yeah.
But we lived in the Beverly Fairfax area. As I said, there were various developments. It was looked upon as a little bit more upper class than the Boyle Heights situation.
Yeah, there's actually a interview section that I use in my things that said if you made $15 a month, your family lived in Boyle Heights. If your dad made $25 a month, you lived in Beverly Fairfax. And then it was on up to Beverly Hills if you learned more than that.
Beverly Hills was an interim. Before that was the Valley. Sherman Oaks.
Right. Glendale.
Guys, and they became largely Jewish in terms of residents.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, a lot of Boyle Heights' residents went east, so straight back into Monterey Park and Glendale. But you've actually hit on a couple things that I would love to expand upon because they're part of my third chapter. First is the timing of your arrival. It makes total sense that you have settled in Fairfax. And part of what I write about being really interesting in this moment in the late 1930s is that those guys I started out with, Chaim Shapiro, Peter Kahn, all those guys have moved out of the neighborhood. Julius Levitt lives in Cheviot Hills. I don't know if you know where that is. And Chaim Shapiro is living in Edendale and Los Feliz. Pinhas is living on the beach in Santa Monica. But yet they choose to sort of make this place the terrain of their activism in the late 1930s, which to me is a deep expression of their kind of commitment to what they'd created there and what they imagined that space to be. The IWO is also much more popular in LA than the Workmen's Circle in this period. I argue part of that is because the communists are willing to do things like interracial organizing. So whereas the Workmen's Circle was limited to, eventually joins English, but it's limited to Yiddish speakers and Jews, the IWO is created on purpose to be a multi-ethnic organization. So in LA, there's a branch for African Americans, there's 2 branches for Mexicans in Boyle Heights. The JPFO, the Jewish People's Fraternal Order. Actually, this is what Jennifer writes about. Exactly. So from what I have read, it was much, much, much more popular by the late 1930s and 40s in LA than the Workmen's Circle was. And that's part of why the Workmen's Circle is working so hard to do new things that might attract the kids. I think a lot of that had to do with the communists' willingness to really go into the other communities in the neighborhood and actively pursue this interracial organizing, which the Workmen's Circle just wasn't doing. And I think for the younger kids, they were really interested in doing that. Roosevelt High, for example, which is the high school in Boyle Heights, was 24%, this is a 1936 survey, 24% American, quote unquote, 25% Jewish, 17% Mexican, 5% Japanese, just these incredibly multi-ethnic spaces. So these kids raised in this multi-ethnic environment had a keen interest in doing things with their non-Jewish friends. And I think in that regard, the IWO became much more popular because it was willing to kind of actively pursue those relationships. But what's interesting about this period is that the IWO is starting to face anti-Semitism within the Communist Party. So what I kind of argue in my chapter is that the IWO is sort of pulling away from the Communist Party a little bit and pursuing its own stuff because they're getting scolded. Literally at one point, the Communist Party official tells the Jewish members of the IWO that they are encouraging anti-Semitism. They're helping the Silver Shirts, is what he says. The Silver Shirts is one of the local fascist groups. So that tension, of feeling this sort of anti-Semitism from within their own organization, which is supposed to be this vanguard of racial tolerance and all this stuff, prompted the Jewish members of the IWO to kind of pull into the Jewish community a little bit more. And like I said, the members of the Workmen's Circle, these socialist guys are defending the communists to folks here in New York who are telling them you're absolutely not allowed to work with them, you absolutely can't talk to them, those are bad guys. And they're saying, hey man, everybody here is doing this stuff, and if we don't do it too, then we're gonna totally collapse. So by 1941, they've actually broken entirely from the Jewish Labor Committee's national apparatus here in New York and formed the Pacific Coast Conference, which I sort of argue is this ultimate expression of their sort of West Coast style of doing things. So I agree with you. I mean, you're absolutely accurate.
Just one other comment. We did know some young men from Boyle Heights who went to fight in Spain.
Right.
In the late...
In 39, yeah.
Yes. And, well, as I remember, one of them did not come back.
Yeah. It was an incredible thing, yeah, that they would have gotten on planes to go and fight the war against fascism. So, yeah, there was, and that's part of the reason that in the 40s, the anti-communism crusade comes down so hard in LA, is because, this sort of sounds controversial to say, but there was the Communist Party in LA had something like 5,000 members, which is far, far bigger than even New York's party, which was, considerable and influential. But there really was this moment in sort of the late 30s and early 40s. And, these communist guys, the IWO, sponsors war bonds drives that raise $1.5 million to support the war. and they get a plane called the Spirit of Boyle Heights, a B-47 bomber that goes to Germany and bombs the Krauts, you know. So. Exactly. So it was what they thought what they were doing was incredibly patriotic and didn't see it as un-American at all. But the campaigns come down so hard and ruin so many lives that's part of the reason this history really hasn't been told. Those scholars who started writing in 1954, you know, they don't want to perpetuate this stereotype, and so they just completely avoid the topic entirely in an effort to sort of whitewash the history, I think. Go ahead.
In the period between the wars,
Mm-hmm.
approximately how large was the Jewish population in LA, and what type of work did most of the people do?
Well, it's tough to say, partially because there wasn't as much of that kind of data being kept at the time. And since so many of these people were in transition, sort of between the censuses, as you might say, censi, I don't know if that's a word, that it's difficult to gauge. At its peak in 1939, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation comes to Boyle Heights, they estimate there's about 35,000 Jews in the neighborhood, whereas...
You're talking about Boyle Heights.
I'm talking about Boyle Heights, right. The citywide estimate in 1930 is 130,000 Jews, but I would say that's probably a little higher than it should be. So it really, like I said, part of the reason the focus has been on the post-war era is that the community just booms. It remains really small until then, and really beginning in the late 30s, as you described, it starts to grow. So it's tough to say. I would say probably around 100,000 people. The bulk of which, and part of the reason Beverly Fairfax becomes a place to live, are getting jobs in Hollywood. So the new arrivals, whereas my guys came in like the 1910s and 20s, the new arrivals in the 30s are mostly coming to work in Hollywood. And that includes all those emigres. You know, there's at least 10 to 15,000 refugees of Hitlerism and everything that's going on in Europe who come to LA. So I'd say maybe 100,000. A lot of them are involved in Hollywood. As I mentioned, you know, skilled trades are still there. Jewish women compose the bulk of UKPOA, which is a cannery union, the bulk of a lot of the defense industry unions, because they're skilled laborers. So it's really a wide variety.
What are a sizable number of them, do they own retail stuff?
Exactly. There's lots of stores. Most of LA's big department stores, like the May Company, is owned by a Jewish family. So really just a wide range of professions. But in the 30s, it shifts decidedly. There's a survey conducted of the Jewish community in LA in 1940 that finds that between 1930 and 1940, the percentage of the Jewish community working as professionals increases, and the percentage working as laborers declines. And part of that is because of the arrival of mass production, right? You get these auto companies, these giant defense companies, and that creates a whole new strata of white-collar administrative positions. Some people call them company men, which Jews, because they've gone to UCLA, are able to take those jobs.
So you're getting American-born college education.
Exactly. That's precisely right. So, you know, the number of trade unionists, even my bakers, precipitously declines. And by the 50s, the bakers union doesn't even exist anymore. So, go ahead.
I'd like to ask you about how overt anti-Semitism,
Sure.
aside from the neighborhood restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
were there expressions of overt anti-Semitism?
You know, this is a subject that my fellow LA Jewish historians debate constantly, because there's been this long-held trope that those covenants I mentioned also included Jews, whereas none of my fellow historians have actually found that, who've looked at any of the covenants. I mean, I imagine on paper a lot of them did, but that maybe in practice they didn't. But in my observation, and this is sort of agreed upon within the LA Jewish Studies community, is that it really doesn't pick up till the 1930s. I think part of that is because, and this is true of all of California, that they arrive at all the same time, right? So they're there just as early as anybody else is. They're just as integrated into, you know, the Chamber of Commerce and the merchant and manufacturers and all the elite social clubs and all that kind of stuff. I think part of it was because the community was such a small minority of people as well, which is to say Jews didn't pose a threat, right? So Herzl would probably think, you know, this is all because they're so small and they're not posing this threat of economic competition, right? So that might be one explanation. But in the 30s, it just explodes. And Carrie McWilliams, who's the former editor of The Nation, who actually works with one of the organizations that organizes this protest, writes a pamphlet in 1935 basically saying that if fascism is going to happen anywhere in the country, it's going to happen here in Los Angeles. And in that pamphlet, he cites a couple things. He cites those Okies and the Arkies that I mentioned, which is to say, you know, and this is an important thing in American history across the country, particularly towns like Detroit and even New York. The Southernization of America is what it's called. Between 1920 and 1940, some 500,000 Southerners, both black and white, leave the South. So we widely associate that with like the Harlem Renaissance, right? We all know that, right? All these new African Americans in Harlem, and they have this. In Southern California, Carrie McWilliams argues it takes the form of the imposition of anti-Semitism. The other thing he cites as an explanation is the Jews of Hollywood, which is to say, if you think of that sort of logic of economic competition, as the Hollywood Jewish community grows and these Jewish studio executives start sort of hobnobbing with the glamorous celebrities, that somehow sort of got people's engines going. I mean, the other thing that he cites that's important to keep in mind is that what he says is basically that because of the role of Hollywood in the economy, anyone's discontent with inequality in the economy can be sort of morphed into anti-Semitism. So he basically says, you know, those Jewish studios executives, they're great guys, wonderful, but because everyone is so angry and poor right now, they're extra mad at the Jewish studio executives. And I didn't include a ton of anti-Semitic imagery in my lecture, but often the local fascist groups are attributing their anger at Jews not just to Jews controlling the economy, but also to vice, right? Which was a big thing in late 30s LA. You've all seen the noir gangster movies, right? Vice was one of their sort of, in late 1930s LA, you might remember this, they recall the mayor at one point, Mayor Frank Shaw, because of his corruption and gangsterism, and they blame him for the spread of vice in the city, which my guys think is just a positive example of fascism happening in real life. But that concern with sort of vice and women's role being degraded and this idea of sort of sexualizing women and corrupting American society, all of that kind of swirls together in the particular breed of fascism that comes in LA. So as far as I can tell, I mean, quite honestly, even these socialists who should be complaining sort of about how everyone's got them down, there's really not a mention of it until you get to the early 1930s and the situation kind of changes. And like I said, I mean, you know, you can look at, I mean, how intimidating is that, right? And there's guys in brown shirts marching around in downtown LA. And 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, for example, Amy Semple McPherson, who's this very popular radio personality and evangelist, she invites Windward Sparks, I want to say, this notorious racist, fascist preacher to come speak at her congregation, you know, a week after Kristallnacht. So it was a very intense environment in that way, and I think that was really for the first time for these guys that they had to kind of fight that sort of racialized battle in a way that they really hadn't before. Anybody?
One other thing about Boyle Heights.
Sure.
I was appointed principal there at Sheridan Street School.
Oh, nice. That's amazing.
1952. And at that time, it was in the heart of Boyle Heights. It was about 80% Jewish children and about 12 or 15 Mexican Americans.
Right.
And every week, and I got to know the kids personally, every week a kid would come by my office and say, Mr. Kravitz, I want to say goodbye. I said, why are you saying goodbye? Because we're moving. Where are you moving? West side.
Right.
West side.
Right.
And west side was a simple word that everybody around there understood.
Right.
And it gradually became less and less desirable because the level of education of those parents was much higher than the education of the parents of the Hispanic Americans.
Right.
So that those children were even different from the others while they were still at
The self-selecting process, right? Yeah. Well, the freeways had a lot to do with it too. I mean, the Baker's headquarters, for example, the 110, which is the first one of these freeways, the first freeway in America, just paves right over the Baker's home, right? So when the Homeowners Loan Corporation comes in and evaluates it as hopelessly heterogeneous, they redline it And as a result, the property values in the neighborhood just drop off. So even just rationally, it would be an unwise investment at that point forward, to buy a house when you know your house property value is going to go down. Exactly. So the freeways they are really a game changer in terms of the values of the properties there. And in my argument, it's less of a sort of white flight phenomenon as much as it is opportunities to get out that some people just didn't have. There's a lot of Mexican Americans leaving the neighborhood at the same time, in part because some of them had served in the war and some of them had been in unions and earned higher incomes, and they're leaving as well. So it really is transformed in that way, but it does lead to this false impression. I mean, Hillary Clinton, for example, comes in 1998 to the Breed Street Shoal, the largest synagogue that they've successfully historically preserved, and makes this sweeping statement about how, the Mexicans today will be just like the Jews were, 100 years ago, and they spoke Yiddish and these guys speak Spanish, but we're all, going to be okay. And it just overlooks the difference in the way that the neighborhood was located and its connectivity to the rest of Los Angeles. Now, that being said, they have rebuilt the streetcar line. So you can now take the subway, which is, I know, the weirdest thing to think about doing in LA ever, but you can take the subway to Boyle Heights again. It gets off in Mariachi Plaza. It's a great little day trip. I highly recommend it next time you're in LA. Be one of your sites. They do, Via Ragosa. And actually, it's really interesting right now because the two people running, there's Wendy Gruhl, whose husband is Jewish and very involved in Israel causes, and Eric Garcetti, who's half Mexican, half Jewish, and claims Boyle Heights as part of his lineage. That's his big thing. He's always sort of talking about how, my family was in Boyle Heights once too. So very much contemporary sort of imagery there. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming.